Hi, welcome to a new episode of Entrepreneurs Insights series. Welcome to the show and welcome Vishal as my co-host as always. How are you doing?
I am good, Guillaume.
Fredrik, Nyberg, good morning, good day to you. Welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
We are very happy to have you. So you are the Asia Pac Managing Director of MedTech Innovator, the largest accelerator of startup in medical device, digital health, in vitro diagnostics. Prior to this, you were the founder and CEO of APAC Med, Asia Pacific Medical Technology Associations. And so you have been helping a lot of founders to grow, scale, raise money, and have a successful entrepreneurial journey. So we're going to learn a lot from you. Thank you.
I hope I can provide a little bit of insight on how we work with companies and what makes them tick.
I like the humility. We don't always have this a lot, but I am not worried about your ability to do that. So tell us a bit more about your journey. Over 30 years in healthcare, right?
Yeah. So first of all, yes, I'm currently with MedTech Innovator. MedTech Innovator Asia Pacific specifically was kicked off in 2019. We have 124 alumni companies. They've gone on to raise well over 200 million in follow-on funding, which is great. Globally, we have 717 alumni. We'll be at about 850 at the end of this year. And those companies have gone on to raise 10 billion US in follow-on equity, which is fairly impressive. 1 in 4 dollars invested in MedTech globally in 2024 went to MedTech Innovator alumni companies.
Wow.
So that's a little bit about the organization I come from. We're a small team, but hopefully can
making a big impact.
Make a reasonable impact. In terms of my own background, and I'll try to be brief here. So I've spent all my life in healthcare, predominantly medical technology, originally from Sweden. I've spent most of my time in Singapore, 3 years in Japan, 5 years in Malaysia. Did run a startup venture in Malaysia for a period of time in medical engineering. Then spent a fair bit of time in strategic consulting as well, until I then started working with APAC Med and set that up back in 2015.
Wow.
Nice.
So you have been in Asia for 20 years, 25 years,
came here
right?
in the 90s. Yes, that's a while back now. I think in the early stages, whether someone is linked to a university or someone is linked to a hospital and has a great idea but not quite sure what to do next, I think, first of all, there are multiple government support programs, especially in places like Singapore, but also in places like Korea and Japan and Taiwan and Australia and elsewhere, and India now as well, that support founders at very early stages. I think when we see early stage companies, and typically we focus on slightly later stage companies. We do a lot of work with the strategics, like Johnson & Johnson. I mentioned Becton Dickinson and Siemens Healthineers and Olympus and others. And they like to see later stage companies. When we do see earlier stage companies, typically they may not necessarily have been bold enough in their ideas. There is a lot of me too, or possibly me better. I think in part of the geographies here, it's linked to where capital comes from.
Yeah.
And I think investors especially in some of the emerging markets, less so in Singapore, Japan, and China, I should say, investors may not be quite as sophisticated and therefore opt to put their money into smaller medtech companies that are easy to understand, short time to market, wearables, digital health. And that's great up to a point, but there's a dime a dozen. We see so many of these companies. Barriers to entry are really low. The founders may be incredibly passionate about what they're doing, but it's not differentiated enough. And companies very often don't have maybe the clinical evidence to support some of the early claims. So getting that in order as well is really important. But I think for smaller companies, obviously it's all about meeting an unmet medical need, but try to look for those that are really novel and something that's unusual, and don't shy away for something that potentially could end up being a class 3 implantable device. We'd love to see more of those products, because we see so many of the digital health, wearable, mobile app technologies. They're great, but it's just become so saturated.
I see. Yeah.
Fredrik and I know each other for a few years now,
We do.
I do remember how it was so difficult to build innovation at scale in Asia. You could have pockets in Japan, you could have pockets in Korea where some amazing innovation comes. But when it comes to Southeast Asia, there was very little that was happening from innovation that was happening at scale. For me, it was really addressing that fact at the core and see if you could build a portfolio of something which is differentiated and something that meets the unmet medical need. I like what Fredrik, you mentioned. When big pharma companies or even big medtech companies, they like something de-risked. They want something much more advanced. But then who does all the earlier work?
Fair question.
And that is where somebody like you and entrepreneurs that are trying to go into medtech innovation and even biotech innovation comes handy, because they have to be crazy enough to go to that point where they build something novel, they build something differentiated, but there has to be method to that madness. So I would love to hear from you, based on your experience, what is that method to madness that somebody pulls in, and the fact that your alumni companies have raised $10 billion, I'm sure there are some nuggets that we have picked up on from that method to madness perspective. So please enlighten us.
Yeah, well, one thing that earlier stage companies should think about, and some of the founders should think about, is being bold and thinking completely outside of the box, and work very closely with clinicians. Unlike pharma, this early stage of research, and you know this well, Vishal, in the early stages of pharmaceutical development and biotech development, you're in a lab with white lab coats. In medtech, it doesn't work that way.
Exactly.
You have to work hands-on with clinicians in the OR, in the ICU, to see how can I impact workflow? How can I make sure that this particular drug is better delivered? How can I facilitate? Is there a better way that they can do this type of surgery?
Absolutely.
If we replace this with a robot, how would that impact outcomes? So the questions even at the very early stage for a medtech founder are very, very different. And I think developing some of those clinical relationships early on is really helpful. Ultimately, you need, if it's assuming that it's a product that will be used in a hospital setting, you need that end user adoption.
You want to create a solution, you want validation. If you want to get bought by somebody big, right?
Right.
And I genuinely think that even in biotech these days, people are getting involved with the physician at a much earlier stage.
That's good.
If you think from a general principle as an entrepreneur, what is your end game?
Right.
Your end game is to get validation.
Yeah.
Your definition of validation could be very different versus what somebody else's definition of validation is. And what you explained to me just now, it really defines validation quite nicely. And I only wish that everybody thinks like that. Not just for medical devices, but in general, as a rule of thumb, think about getting validation, getting KOLs involved in it much earlier, is when you have that scientific validation upfront, your value grows exponentially.
For sure. What I should add, though, is that, and something that we see that's fairly common amongst smaller companies, is they may get that clinical validation from a single clinician or a small group at one hospital.
True.
And saying that you got clinical validation, you're going to go and conquer the world because you have a relationship at Tan Tock Seng Hospital, frankly, is not good enough.
No. Right.
You need to go outside of, if you're based in Singapore, you need to go outside of Singapore and get that clinical validation elsewhere.
Right. Yeah.
And that's something a lot of smaller companies are struggling with. They have that one first, and sometimes if you've got a clinician founder, it gets even more complicated, right? But to be fair, a lot of the clinician founders that we work with are very open-minded and very, very creative, and they recognize that they need to go out and get that clinical validation elsewhere.
That's actually the first stage of scaling, right? When you think about it, before you scale the business, scale your addressable audience of having more feedback from the industry. Yeah. I was about to ask you about how many practitioners, clinicians do you have as founders? Is it because what you said earlier is that understanding the medical practice at its core and understanding the problem is where you can create bold ideas, and one would argue that it's easier to see the problem or to understand the landscape when you are in the OR every day as opposed to being an outsider. So I was just curious, in MedTech specifically, do you see a sizable portion of your founders who are actually coming from the practitioner surgical game? Or
it's a great question, and we haven't looked at that specifically. We should dive into our application data and figure that out. It is a minority. I would guess it might be 1 in 5, one in something like that.
Right.
But it's something we should take a look at. It's difficult for a lot of clinicians to take that one step out of the clinical setting and run a company. It's not necessarily something that every clinician thinks about. They may come up with a great idea, but ideally they'd like to maybe take on a chief medical officer role or become a scientific advisor, and then have someone else go out there and raise money and do all these. The other build the team and file patents and do all those other fun things that need to happen as well.
Yeah.
And of course you know all this, Vishal. So I think it's a growing number of clinicians that take on that role and are willing to take that step.
Yeah.
But they also have an opportunity cost because they might be running their own practice and that might be going very well. So maybe having to live without a salary for 2-3 years is just not an option for them. So I think they're trying to find ways that they can support whatever they maybe have invented.
Yeah.
Which might be a better approach.
But that's good because on the flip side of it, it also means for the majority of people out there who are not practitioners anyway, that there's still opportunities for them to create a fantastic value for the industry. But the way to do it is not to second guess anything, but to talk to those who are doing the work every day and get some insights from them. Yeah, which is true in any setting. It's rarely a mistake to speak to your customers.
Right.
That's a very fair point. No matter if you're doing
cynical here, but ironic rather.
It's the right thing to do. You need to talk to your customers.
Yeah.
The definition of customer changes across different industry.
Yeah,
the principle of business doesn't really change, right? You mentioned a very interesting comment about founders and clinician academicians trying to just get validation from one clinician. Is that a common practice you're seeing in Asia? And if that is the case, why do you think that is the case?
I think a lot of companies begin maybe with the single relationship between a clinician inventor and a business-minded person.
So it's a comfort.
And that could be a biomedical engineer, someone with an MBA, someone who would seize the business potential in this. So that's how a lot of medtech businesses begin.
Right.
And I think the challenge very often is, at what point do you limit the clinical input and feedback to just that one co-founder clinician you're working with? And at what point do you go out and speak to clinicians in other parts of the ecosystem, in other parts of your country, in beyond your borders, in different parts of the world, and getting that feedback from a wider audience early on can be a bit of a challenge.
And do you think that these founders tend to pigeonhole themselves because they are just comfortable? Do you see any lack of coming out of the comfort zone kind of mentality over here, or you see, I'm happy with one, might as well continue until I can?
Yeah, no, we do see that from time to time. And sometimes it can be the specific clinical specialty of the co-founder clinician. He or she is only interested in this particular therapeutic area, this particular treating this particular disease. when the more business-minded co-founder then actually does the research, she sees that, well, there's a much larger opportunity here in something else, in breast cancer or pancreatic cancer or something else.
Yeah.
And then trying to convince that original co-founder that, look, we got to look outside of this fairly narrow indication.
Yeah.
And that can be a challenging conversation.
So is the solution to that having a definite answer is having a co-founder? Is that's a very, very important part, right, for any business?
It is, and I'd love to have your perspective on this as well, because
he's definitely sold on the idea of having co-founders, right?
Yeah.
For you, it was
being a CEO is a lonely job, and
Exactly.
having co-founders make a lot of sense. Yeah. It does. As you scale and grow, it raises maybe some possible complications in terms of who gets to be the CEO, what sort of share allocation do you give to each, what's the time allocation, who does what, roles, responsibilities, all of that. But I'd love to have your perspective on that, Vishal, as well. Certainly, these are challenges that we see all the time. We do have a number of companies that just have a single founder, and that's okay too.
Yeah.
But having a co-founder is no doubt is helpful in the early stages, because it is a lonely job.
Oh no, absolutely.
We put some things in place at MedTech Innovator to help founders and leaders bounce ideas off peers and so on. We've got something called leadership pods, which I'm happy to share more about later. But Vishal, you have a co-founder when you set up?
Yeah, of course I have a co-founder, and I'm a big proponent of having a co-founder, because the whole idea around having a team is you know where your gaps are,
right, and
you complementarily fill those gaps if you are a good founder and if you're a good co-founder, right? So I feel having a co-founder, it only makes you better rather than saying, oh, you're sharing it. In fact, it puts up a lot of credibility with whoever you talk to.
But I think you are touching on something critical here, which is also the ability for one to be very clearly identifying his strengths and his weaknesses. You know, we live in a world where it's easy to show the strength, but we are sometimes a bit delusional as to where we need help and what we actually... And we don't know what we don't know, and we don't want to talk about this or ask ourselves.
Everybody wants to show their strength, right?
Right. No, but it's good that as far as you are concerned, you have been pitching this yin and yang approach, right? You are saying, that person is exactly the complement that I need.
Challenge then, of course, and we'll maybe talk more about that later, as companies scale, there's then the other inflection point, which is when you've raised so much money. And again, I'd really be interested to have your thoughts on this, where a lot of companies realize that, including the investors may realize that the founder and the CEO at the early stages of development may not be the optimal CEO and the best person to take the company forward.
And you know what, Fredrik, that is the absolutely right mentality to have. Because if one CEO and a founder thinks that he can run the company for ages and ages,
right,
that's never the right mentality. I would actually think that the CEO and the founder should be mindful, and the co-founder, even for that matter, should be mindful that they started the company with a vision. Right. They want to be so big in the future. And when you get to that point, you should be gracious enough to say, well, you know, I did my job of building things.
Right.
Now, you do your job of growing it, right? And I'm not saying that should be a common trend. I'm just saying they should be prepared for it if there is a bigger play at scale, right? So I think that's...
But on this, I agree, but I think the important element also is the fact that a founder like yourself and many others who have had a corporate experience before being a founder, they have seen what different leadership traits are required in a larger organization where you know how to delegate, to empower, you know how to create a team around you that is running the show. You understand you don't need to be so into the details anymore. Conversely, maybe a younger entrepreneur or someone who has never been exposed to it is maybe likely facing this glass ceiling. You're right. He has been used or she has been used to run the show and do everything for 5 years, but then when it's 500 of us or much more, this is not what we expect from you.
For sure. And the skills to lead an organization like that are very different.
Very different. Yeah. Very different.
Let's talk about the vision. Let's talk about raising capital. Let's talk about how to communicate, to pitch.
I was just hosting a webinar yesterday on fundraising and navigating term sheets and so on.
Perfect timing.
Everyone's raising money, of course. And maybe on that topic, at the very early stages, of course, getting the initial funding through friends and family probably makes sense before you start to get a first institutional investors on board. So that's always bootstrapping in the early days is probably an initial sensible approach and kind of pressure test whether this is something that you really want to do, and get some feedback from stakeholders around the ecosystem and so on. And then when you see that you have a plan to scale and take it to the next step, then obviously it makes sense to speak to investors. The challenge with working with or reaching out to institutional investors, of course, early on, knowing who to speak to and getting those early introductions. It's very easy for a smaller company to not necessarily do their homework on those investors and try to pitch to an institutional investor that really doesn't write checks, the size that you're looking for, or they're not in your therapeutic area or clinical domain or whatever it may be. So there's a lot of initial homework that needs to be done on the part of the startup companies, and we see that missing sometimes. Right. You've raised an impressive amount of money to date, 43 million, I believe.
43 million, yeah.
And again, interesting parallel there with MedTech, because it's very rare that we see startup ventures raising that amount of money. And obviously we can talk about being capital efficient or working with smaller amounts of money in medtech versus biotech. But some of those initial relationships with VCs are,
so doing the right research, making sure that you are addressing the right audience for your
and
segment.
then having a good brushing up the pitch. And that there are a lot of we see every year we see about 500 pitches, 500 applications. Some of them you can typically tell the profile of the founder when you see them. Some are like academic papers with pages and pages of charts and very few give a very clear narrative of what's the problem they're trying to solve. What's the unmet medical need? And linking that to a simple story that the listener can take on board, and they, if they can't get it in the first 3 slides, then they're typically going to switch off.
You are so right, Fredrik. I have observed, just as a piece of opinion, I have observed that story building is so important.
It's something we do spend a fair bit of time on with our cohort companies, the ones that make it into our accelerator. And it's completely individual. Every company's narrative and story is, of course, different. But having one that is compelling, ideally one that has some personal connection to the founder, is it can be their grandmother, or it can be their child, or it can be some experience they've had, and not spending too much time on that, but then linking that to why they're passionate about solving this particular problem.
So make it relatable, give very
absolutely
human touch and context on it, but at the same time, as you said earlier, being able to explain very clearly what is the problem you are solving, and if it takes 10 minutes to
and then segue into the size of that market opportunity, of course. But that initial story is one that's really important. A founder makes some assumptions about what an investor expects to see in a slide deck, and they put it in there, and they're not really interested in that at all. 10-year sales projections. No investor is interested to see a slide deck that has a 10-year sales projection in it. So don't bother showing it. Put it in an appendix if you have to. Focus on your competition. Focus on your regulatory strategy or something else.
My DNA, even though I'm an introvert by nature, I became extrovert by profession. And that's why I do all these things that an introvert would not feel comfortable doing. I do it because I love to push myself outside of, anyway. The point is that I am also, my DNA is more in sales and marketing, in business. I know how to sell. I know how to talk about problems. I know how to position a solution. And I cannot help myself than thinking that at this stage, when you meet investors, you need to be able to have this storytelling like a good sales pitch would have. And so for those who are in this very scientific space, maybe creating a bit of a caricature here, but some of them might be more comfortable talking about the technicality of the product than the big picture, than the story, so I was just thinking, listening to you, what would be the ideal persona to be on stage and raise money here? Is it the technician? Is it the scientific expert? Is it the spokesperson, salesy-ish kind of persona? Which one is the ideal aggregate if you had to mix them?
It's a good question. It's ideally someone who's got
everything,
all of these traits. And, having said that, though, I mean, we do see some very, very academic pitches that are presented by professors at universities out of Korea or elsewhere, and technically they may be onto something that's potentially revolutionary, but it doesn't come across because it gets lost in all the
You need to, if you don't understand
else, right? And we might very well take them on board as a accelerator company anyway. We would say, well, this is a company with real potential. Yeah. They just need help with their pitch deck. Yeah. And that's something we can help them with. Yeah. But to your point, I think having someone who has some, not necessarily direct sales experience, but someone who can articulate the value proposition well, who can explain the narrative of the company and tell the story of how they founded this and what their ambitions are going forward, and doing that in a credible way. I think that goes a long way. Yeah. Sometimes you have clinician founders that are very articulate and speak very well and can do that. Sometimes they can be a little bit academic, or they can be a little bit too clinically focused. Yeah. In which case they'd be better off to bring someone else in. Yeah. And maybe they just they just step aside for that one pitch. What we see quite often happening, and this may be a language issue as well, when we have companies that pitch maybe from China or from Japan, or I mentioned Korea as well, is they'll have one person who is maybe their sales or business development person, who will do the main pitch. Right. But they will make sure that they have the chief medical officer in the same room to answer questions. Yeah. And that's usually a formula that works well. Yeah. To make sure that when those technical or clinical questions come up, they have instant answers. Yeah.
Moving along on the next phase of growth, right? Yeah. So you have made a decision. You want to set up the company. You make a pitch. You talk to investors. You try and raise some capital. How do you see the growth changing the mindset of how the company is run? And then with the institutional investors coming on board, how does that really change the DNA of the founders and the biotech companies and so on and so on, right? So could you give us some insights on what becomes more important?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't think there's a single simple answer to this. Yeah. But yes, a company obviously transitions into that slightly later stage phase, and that might be a pre-Series A or a Series A, typically for a MedTech company.
Or even Series B these days. Right?
Even a Series, although having said that, a Series B for a MedTech company is relatively late stage. Okay. They would have gotten quite far ahead at that point. Yeah. But to answer your question, I think there are a few things that sort of need to fall into place. Obviously, at that point, they may very well have some initial institutional money, so their investors are going to be setting some expectations in terms of clinical evidence and building, collecting data, or filing for patents or whatever it may be. So those, of course, are all things that need to be addressed. But I think for a founder at that point in time, if it's a first-time founder, there'll be a lot of expectations for him or her to perform in areas where maybe they have no prior experience.
Okay.
And that's okay. I think the thing then is to really build a support network. And that's sometimes overlooked.
Yeah.
And this is maybe the point at which, don't make this sales pitch for MedTech Innovator, but it's a good time to join an accelerator.
Right.
And there are other accelerators that are very good that are out there as well. But it's a good way to expand your network, to have someone critically look at what it is that you do, your presentation, the stage you're at, and what your next 6 to 12 months look like in terms of development, strategic priorities, and so on, without there being any strings attached. We don't take any equity in the companies that join our accelerator, for example. So they can join and they can get all these feedback and get mentorship and all this for free, essentially.
Right.
And there are plenty of those types of opportunities available. And at that stage, it's really good for a founder or co-founders to take advantage of that.
And is the expectation that the company will be bought at the time, not from MedTech Accelerator, in general, in medical devices companies, is the expectation that the companies will be bought at a point where you are just about to go to market?
Not necessarily. I think, again, there's a big difference here between MedTech and biotech.
Yes.
Happy to have your thoughts about that. I think that point of acquisition or a potential liquidity event is quite different between those two types of companies.
No, very interesting.
But we do encourage founders to think about the pathway to exit relatively early on. Yeah. Typically in MedTech, it's a trade sale more often than an IPO.
Yeah.
There have not been a lot of IPOs in MedTech recently, so it's a relatively challenging climate from that point of view. Trade sale exits, they do happen all the time, and that's ultimately what our strategic partners are looking for. They partner with us because we provide them deal flow, and they get to see cutting-edge technologies they otherwise would have missed. They may not necessarily, typically, rarely would acquire a company at the end of our program, but they may start a research and development collaboration. They may start a licensing agreement. They may say, well, look, we really like what you're doing, but come back to us in 9 months when you've hit this one milestone, and it may be FDA approval or it may be something else. So that's typically what then happens.
And so for a MedTech founder who is building a very innovative product or set of solutions and so on, who has this aspiration to obviously have a valuable portfolio to sell to a bigger player out there. He's going through, as you said, the various vetting process and so on, and alignment with these big players. But obviously, there's a pretty unbalanced situation here, right? Between a giant MedTech company versus a very small founder. So how do you create traction with the big ones while maintaining some independence in the way you drive your business? Is there any possibility to do that, or you have to get in bed with one or the other pretty early on? Because
it's a great question, and we typically ask that directly of our strategic partners, and we ask it of VC investors, and how do they view that, and generally. Unless it is a very tight exclusive arrangement, which is rare at the early stages of development, institutional investors, they encourage discussions with strategics and partnerships. And they don't necessarily see that having a partnership with Medtronic now is going to stop you from eventually get acquired by Stryker or whatever it may be. So typically for the big strategics, they will work with early stage companies at a point when they may not even take an equity stake. If they do, it may be a small minority stake, and they won't go public on that anyway. And they just want to maintain that relationship and see how the companies gain traction, how they hit some milestones, when they start to get some regulatory approvals, and at some point then they might go in and write that check. So that does happen. We've had, I think, to date 55 or 56 acquisitions.
That's a global number.
That's a global number. In Asia Pacific, it's about 4. We had an interesting one in December of last year. And sorry, I digress here, but I thought I'd mention this. So
no, it's good
we
to
had
give some examples. Yeah, please go ahead.
It's not often that we see outright acquisitions, but one of our cohort companies out of Hanoi, Vietnam, in healthcare AI was acquired, and they were in our cohort 2024. They were acquired by NVIDIA. For an undisclosed sum. We have some idea what the sum is, but I won't comment on that. But that was part of NVIDIA's healthcare AI strategy of entering the Vietnamese market, and that was really interesting, and not only gave that a boost of confidence to healthcare AI companies in the region, but to companies specifically working in that domain in Southeast Asia. So that was great. So we do see that from time to time.
What's your advice to the entrepreneurs when they have reached to that point where it's 100 and they want to go from 100 to 1,000?
Right.
What do they need to keep in mind for that?
Yeah. So typically for a medtech company, that inflection point might be when they start to generate substantial revenue.
Right.
Because that changes the game completely.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, they're attractive to a whole different group of institutional investors. They can stand on their own 2 feet, and they have the ability to scale and potentially reach those sort of multiples. Yeah. And at that point in time, I guess it's really a question of what is the founders, what do they see as their own end game in this? Right. For some, they really just want to reach that one liquidity event and exit and go and sail around the world. To be honest, that's fairly rare. What they typically will do is they'll go on and fund another company.
It's addictive.
But yeah, it is. It is. We do see a handful of serial entrepreneurs that are doing exceptionally well. But I think many of them will recognize at that point in time that it's not only do they need to then focus on, in this case, revenue generation and scaling, but they need to very much focus on the team and making sure that they have an optimal leadership team and an optimal team to manage this. It raises a number of questions and something that we speak about to our cohort companies as part of the Accelerator. What are the geographies that they then expand into? And everyone wants to expand into the US. And what does that require? Do I need to set up a legal entity in the US? Do I need to have US investors on board? How do I start hospital pilots in the US? What are the hospitals I should work with? How do I build distribution networks? Because you may have good traction in Asia Pacific with initial revenue, but you realize for you to hit that 1,000 or whatever the multiple was, you need to get into the US market. It is the world's number 1 medtech market.
Is it very difficult to get commercial ready? For our audience, I think they would love to hear.
It's not straightforward. There are complexities with the US market, and we actually launched in partnership with Enterprise Singapore last year a US market access program specifically for Singapore-based startups that were mature enough to want to take that step to scale into the US. And we just came back from the US, and we had 10 companies last year, with another 10 companies this year, and they need to think about we allocate individual value coaches to them, so they need to think about how do they articulate value, how do they navigate the reimbursement systems in the US.
What's the average timeline and dollar value required to take one medical device from the time it's about to get approval to actually getting it to the market?
It depends probably what is the complexity of that device. Is it a class 1 device? Then it's very quick. It's near instant. If it's a class 3 implantable, then you need to launch that with so much more evidence and clinical data, of course.
Is there a number that comes to your mind if it's a class 3 device?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think what we encourage companies to do is not to sit and wait and start their commercial plan only once they've received regulatory approval.
Right.
You need to plan this well ahead of time
So
and make sure that that once you get your regulatory approval, you then have your reimbursement strategy in place. You know how you're going to work with some of the procurement systems in the US, and that's a whole separate topic, an area of complexity. And do you then have your distributors or your direct sales team in place, and building all of that. So getting all of that ready. I think if you have it ready, it can be done within months. But more likely than not, we're looking at maybe 6 to 12 at least.
Okay.
Well,
Post regulatory approval.
thank you so much for being with us on the show, Fredrik. It was great.
My pleasure.
Vishal, as always, thank you.
Thank you, Guillaume. And thank you, Fredrik.
Thank you all very much for joining this episode of Entrepreneurs Insights. Make sure to subscribe. You can follow Fredrik on LinkedIn through the link in the description, or reach out to MedTech Innovators. Thank you so much, and see you soon. Bye-bye.